Okay, hello everyone, it's me, Profesor here, and as you can clearly see, it's definitely time for hockey weather. Definitely that time of season again to break out all the old jackets. I got my Red Wings jacket here. I got a couple of old Ducks jackets too. I've been, as I mentioned, I've been a hockey fan for over 20 years now, and I've got a few jackets that go back to about 1992, 1993, 94. So they're still in relatively good shape. So I'm definitely going to be holding on to those as long as I can keep fitting in those things. All right, well listen. What I want to do for you guys today is talk a little bit more about the immigration portion of the Big Three forum topics. Of course, those due dates are just right around the corner, and as we get closer toward Thanksgiving, I will of course keep giving you reminders in the announcement section and maybe in a couple more videos about when those due dates are coming up. But in this one, I'll talk. I want to specifically go ahead and elaborate upon upon one of the parts on the immigration Big Three topic, and that of course is the idea of immigration. And as I've indicated in the last couple of weeks, I decided to make a change on the movie portion for that. And again, just as a reminder as to how the immigration portion works, there's two things you have to do. There are two steps to it, and you can probably see behind me before I continue. My old buddy Nick is lurking around the neighborhood, so don't be surprised if he hops up here and barges in on the video process. But I'll try to keep him at bay so he doesn't cause too much mayhem and mischief, just like that guy in that Allstate commercial. All right, but in any case, the way the immigration topic works, and speaking of mayhem, there is Mr. Mayhem right here. There are two things that you need to do. Number one is review an article on current immigration from any of the reputable newspapers that are out there. And of course, you can go online and get stuff from the LA Times, New York Times, the Washington Post always has some great stories, and even some of the more local ones too. UT San Diego, of course, has been on immigration for many years, so I'm sure you can find some pretty good articles from the UT. Other newspapers from the area, I know up here in Riverside County, the Riverside Press Enterprise has articles too, so if you want to check the Riverside Press Enterprise, you can definitely do that. Other local papers in California, I think the Sacramento Bee, newspapers from Fresno, the San Francisco Chronicle. And any of those, even USA Today, some of the more national ones, you can find stuff too. And if you branch out into some of the more other national ones too, like the Huffington Post or the Daily Beast and Newsweek, those are some options too you can check out. So that's the first stage. Find a current contemporary article about the immigration topic, and of course, the election is just. Actually, as I'm recording this, the election is coming up tomorrow on Tuesday. So undoubtedly, oops. Crazy cat. Undoubtedly, that's going to be a topic in the election, so you can probably find something there too. So that's the first stage. Choose an article, and then part of your discussion, talk about your article, and then have a link to your article within your discussion too. Just use the hyperlink section right there in the discussion board as your that is in the same area in the tools section when you're typing it in your comments. And then the next stage is of course to talk about one of two films. And as I mentioned, I made a change in the films. A Day Without a Mexican is still a good choice. You can check out. I think I've got an old study guide from last semester or last fall, which I'll add pretty soon to the class. So there's really no need for me to really say too much about Day Without a Mexican at this point in time. But what I do want to say is I want to say a few things about the film My Family, Mi Familia, and that's sort of a last-minute adjustment because I wanted to use El Norte, but the film keeps disappearing on YouTube, I guess due to copyright issues and things of that nature. So instead of trying to find El Norte, I'm substituting it with a 1995 film My Family, Mi Familia, which came out in 1995 and is directed by Gregory Nava. Nava, incidentally, is the guy behind the El Norte film, which came out in 1982, 83, so sometime in the early 80s. So what I want to go ahead and do for you is I'll quickly recap some of the main points, not give away too much about the plot, but just touch upon some of the events in terms of the years, in terms of the culture, society, politics, economics, things of that nature, and cue you in on some key themes to be looking out for, and also just maybe and also give some warnings about the film, because let me make one thing clear here. This film got an R rating, and there's a lot of harsh language, especially in Spanish. So those of you who know Spanish, undoubtedly you're probably going to chuckle at some of the various scenes as the movie progresses. But since I grew up on the west side of National City, going to elementary school in National City, a lot of the language, it's nothing new to me. I recall first and second grade and third grade, all the way through elementary school, my friends just calling each other names and this and that. I'm not going to repeat the names here. You probably get the idea of some of the terms, but some of the stuff that's mentioned in the film, these are things that I remember growing up. So it's really nothing new from my perspective. But just be aware of that, and there are some harsh terms in English too. I'm not going to repeat the terms, but you know which terms I'm talking about. Those are in the film. Also, too, there's a little bit of female frontal nudity. This comes out toward the end of the film. It's not much. It's only for a few seconds, but I just want to give a warning about that. Again, I don't want anybody to get upset and complain to my dean, Dr. Castaños, or my chairwoman, Dr. Ferris, at History Department. It's really hard to find, I guess, in these days to find good movies which don't have these types of elements. But I just wanted to issue this warning out there. So in case any of you are offended by these types of things, then definitely don't watch this film. Watch it there without a Mexican instead. But if you do want to go and watch the film, what I will do is just warn you as I go through this in terms of where some of these, especially the nudity part, comes in. So I want to go ahead and warn you a little bit more about that as I go through my description on the various parts of the film. But again, one final note about that. In case, if this type of stuff really bothers people, I don't want people complaining, going to the dean and going to my chairwoman. Talk to me first. You want to talk to me face to face about this, and you think that this is something that really bothers you, I'll be happy to meet with you on campus. So just give me a heads up, give me a week or two notice so I can arrange my schedule, and I'll meet you on campus so we can talk more about this. And if you have any suggestions as to what type of films I should use instead of this, please let me know. I'm open to criticism about these types of things, but you got to talk to me first. Again, don't go to the dean, don't go to my chairwoman. Talk to me first in case things like the language and the nudity in this film really bothers you. Okay, well, having said that, let's talk about the film. All right, what I did is I posted the film in 13 parts right there in the external links and video section. So all 13 parts of the film are there, so you can go part by part. Each section, except for one section, I think it's chapter 7, part 7, is... It's 3 minutes, but every part is about 10 minutes. So you can watch the film in 13 bite-sized chunks, so to speak. But if you want to watch the entire film uninterrupted on YouTube, if you just type in "My Family, Mi Familia," there is a link in which you can watch the entire 2-hour and 5-minute film without any type of interruption. But if you want to, silly gato loco. Speaking of using terms in Spanish here. So without further ado, and before this guy really starts to cause a lot of mischief and mayhem here, let me go and tell you a little bit about what's happening in each part, and then I'll conclude with some of the study questions that you can use in talking about the film. Well, the film opens up in the 1920s, and the narrator of the film is a character by the name of Paco, played by Edward James Olmos, and Paco is the main narrator. He's a writer. He's the writer. So it's through his point of view that we hear about the story. So the film starts off in post-revolutionary Mexico in the 1920s, and here's where the patriarch of the family, Jose Sanchez, leaves Mexico. Again, it's post-revolutionary Mexico. Things are tough in Mexico because of the politics and the economics and the convulsions, turbulence in society. This is the type of stuff that drove my grandmother out of Mexico in the late 1910s. So a lot of the factors here that's mentioned in the film, I can definitely relate to from my personal experience. Jose Sanchez makes his way to California. and he encounters a distant relative by the name of El Californio. Keep in mind, Los Angeles already had a strong Mexican community going back to the days in which Mexico governed California until the U.S.-Mexico War was concluded in 1848. So El Californio is, you might say, one of the last old-time Mexicans who was born in California when it was still Mexican territory. So that takes place early on in part one. Jose Sanchez falls in love. He meets the love of his life, Maria. So Jose and Maria Sanchez are the patriarchs of the family, and we meet the first of the two families. So Paco is the first, and his sister Irene, or Irene, Irene in Spanish. Those are the first two of the children that we meet in part one as the family starts building its life in LA in the 1920s. Okay, now part two goes to the Great Depression. We're not giving away too much of the plot. Here is where the politics of the United States, stuff we touched upon a couple of weeks ago, that comes to the forefront. The Great Depression and the issue of repatriation, that is sending Mexicans, even U.S. citizens who are of Mexican background, sending them back to Mexico. So that's what happens here in part two. And at the same time, we also meet the third member of the Sanchez family, the third sibling. This is the brother named Chucho. So Chucho is the third of them after Paco and Irene. All right, now in part three, we fast forward to the 1950s, and this, of course, is the post-World War II era. It's the era of, you might say, James Dean, rock and roll, Elvis, all of that fun stuff. And not surprisingly, some of the members of the Sanchez family are taken in by a lot of the ideas and themes of rock and roll in the 1950s. And keep in mind, one of the pioneers of rock and roll was, of course, a Mexicano, Richie Valens, famous for La Bamba. Richie Valens is actually short for Richie Valenzuela, so he dropped Valenzuela and became Valens, of course, for mass consumption purposes. But again, Mexican Americans in LA were among the early pioneers in rock and roll. Richie Valens was among them, and that sentiment is definitely being played out here. We meet some of the other members of the family. There's the younger sister Antonia, or Tony for short. There's the other brother Guillermo, also known as Memo, and then there's a little one, the favorite of the family. That's Jimmy. Jimmy, as an older brother, he'd be played by Jimmy Smits later on in the film. So we'll meet the older Jimmy as the film progresses. This is happening in part three of the story. We see the life of the Sanchez family in the late 1950s. All right, let me get this page out of here. And let me go on to part four. I need to say one quick thing about part four. For some reason, the link is broken. There seems to be a copyright issue, and the audio track wasn't working, and I couldn't even get the film to that portion to load up as I was previewing the film, looking over the film yesterday. So let me just give you a quick summary of what's happening in part four. But if you don't want to watch that portion, of course, you can watch the entire film, the entire 2-hour segment. In part 4, Chucho gets into a lot of trouble, and he has problems with the gang known as the El Rincon. El Rincon is a gang. So the gangs of Los Angeles, that's been evident here. Of course, we touched upon a little bit about that with the Zoot Suit riots. So this is something that persisted in LA, and of course still to this day in modern times. But the leader of El Rincon was a guy named Butch, and Butch was Chucho's rival. So the clash between Butch and Chucho, that's what's happening in part 4. And then we also find out that Antonia, or Tony, she wants to become a nun. All the boys in the neighborhood who are after her, they're really upset about that. They lament this. Oh my gosh, que Dios mío, this carajo, this, it's a shame, it's a tragedy, blah blah blah. So you can imagine all the young boys in the community getting upset about that. And then we hear more. We see more about the younger brother Guillermo, or Memo. Memo's a very studious one, so keep that point in mind. We see more about Memo's character a little bit later on as the film unfolds. Okay, now part 5 works, so let me go ahead and just quickly touch upon what's happening in part 5. Chucho's troubles really start to tear apart at the family. So the clash between Chucho and Jose, the father, that really starts to come to the forefront. And things got so bad that a fight broke out, much along the lines of what you would see in, say, films like West Side Story or Rebel Without a Cause. We see that type of element happening in a fight between Butch and Chucho. I won't give you the results of that fight, but let's say things get really bad fast for Chucho, and that's what continues on into part 6. 6, Chucho's troubles just seem to escalate. But at the same time, the family is enjoying a lot of the cultural events, cultural aspects of life in the U.S. And one of the interesting things that happens in Part 6 is that they watch I Love Lucy. So when they're watching I Love Lucy, watch that scene really, really close and see what that tells you about life. About life in the United States at that point in time, not just for immigrant families, but for families in general. That is, what does I Love Lucy seem to represent for American families? It doesn't matter if they're Anglo-American, African-American, or Mexican-American. Just keep that notion in mind as you're watching Part 6 of the film. Okay, Part 7, we fast forward to the third generation of the Sanchez family. So we started with the 20s and 30s. We finished off with the 1950s. So Part 7 takes us into the 1970s. And now Jimmy, the youngest, he's a young man. Here's where Jimmy Smith starts to come into the picture. And Jimmy, you might say, is a loner. He kind of Jimmy idolized his older brother Chucho. So a lot of the stuff that Chucho did in the 1950s, you might say Jimmy does in the 1970s. So watch that as the story unfolds in Part 7. Okay, and I've got my Part 8 notes over here, so let me just get this one sheet out of here. Okay, now in Part 8, Tony changes. So whereas Tony wanted to become a nun earlier, we find that Tony has some really big news which sends shockwaves throughout the family. And interestingly, Scott Bakula, of course famous for Quantum Leap and and the new NCIS show, the New Orleans one, Scott Bakula's in the film, so he comes out in this segment here. But what's interesting here is that here's where you might say immigration issues and U.S. foreign policy start to come to the forefront, especially with respect to what's happening in Central America in the 1970s and the 1980s. Just to give you a quick scan of what's happening, the U.S. supported a lot of right-wing governments in Central America, especially in Guatemala and El Salvador. So El Salvador becomes a focal point of the story, and here's where Tony, the younger sister, enters into the into the picture, and Tony takes it upon herself to intervene in the case of a maid who's Salvadoran, and Jimmy, you might say, gets thrown into the situation through you might say no input of his own, so to speak. So in Part 9, here's where Jimmy's life gets complicated, in that he's married to the Salvadoran maid by the name of Isabel, and at first the relationship is kind of rocky, but then things start to improve between Jimmy and Isabel. But one thing to keep in mind is note the difference in terms of how the generations view marriage. Pay attention to how Tony views marriage compared to the mother Maria. So of course Maria at this point in time, she's probably in her 60s, maybe early 70s at this point of the story. So her views on marriage are much different than the way Tony views marriage, and that's what's happening here in Part 9. Okay, Part 10 is where the female nudity comes in. Here's where Jimmy's wife Isabel is partially nude in this scene, so just beware of that. If you don't want to watch this, then just skip this section completely. But the point about Chapter 10 that's really significant. This boy's relentless. He just refuses to. He just definitely wants to be on camera. Sniffles, the other kitty, she's just tucked away on her chair right now. She's not moving, but this guy likes to be in a whole lot of trouble, just like some of the characters in the film. Okay, but what's interesting about Chapter 10, that is the nudity portion notwithstanding, is the fact that Jimmy and Isabel really start to relate to each other, and their experiences, their tragic experiences, you might say, really brings them closer together, because Isabella talks about what happens in El Salvador with respect to the politics of the country, and how the government in El Salvador treated a lot of the dissidents, especially those of the union labor activists, and that's where Isabella's father, whom she mentions in Chapter 10, Part 10, comes into picture. That's what's happening in Part 10. Now, in Part 11, Jimmy's troubles just continue. It looked like Jimmy was starting to clean his act up, that is, be responsible, be a man, ser hombre, take care of his family. But Jimmy starts to revert to his old tactics, and this really drives the family nuts. The fathers want anything to do with him. The brothers and sisters don't want anything. But Baco has an interesting view about this, and I want you to pay close attention to what Baco says about Jimmy. I won't repeat what Baco says about Jimmy here, but what he says about Jimmy is really telling, and I want you to keep in mind. I want you to want to contemplate is this something that's really common in, say, immigration, that is, families of immigrants? Is it because of the fact that life in the U.S. is much harder for them because whether it's the language barrier, the religion barrier, the politics, whatever, the economics, is it because of that some members of the family, of immigrant families, take things harder, but they do that because it, how can I put this? It serves the family. Maybe I'm not making sense now, but when you watch part 11, again, watch what Paco says about Jimmy, and you tell me what you think about that. And again, I've got this information written down on the study guide, which I've got linked up in the section in the section here with the film. Okay, parts 12 and 13. Let me go ahead and wrap things up here. In part 12. We finish off with we meet Jimmy's son. Jimmy's son is a little husband of Carlitos. Carlitos is the neighborhood dentist, the menace. He causes trouble left and right. You know, he's just as bad as maybe the South Park kids, maybe even worse. So Carlitos becomes, you might say, the center of the story as the story reaches its conclusion. And we get, but in part 12 is a really interesting scene, and here's where you might say here's a clash between values in terms of how each family member views upward mobility. Because right now, at this point of the story, all the brothers and sisters are older. They've got their own families. They've got their own lives. Each one seems to interpret success differently. I mean, look at the way Paco views success. Look at the way Irene views success. Look at how Tony views success. But look at how Guillermo or Memo views success. What does he do to, in essence, prove himself, and how are his views clashing with that of his family, that is, especially of Jose and Maria? So the scene gets really wild and crazy. I'm not going to give you all the details, but let's say Carlitos causes a bit of mischief and mayhem, much like my boy right here causing mischief and mayhem. So watch that as chapter 12, as part 12 finishes up. Finally, in part 13, you might say, here is where everything comes all together again. The final scene, we see Jose and Maria. They're back at their kitchen table. They're talking to each other like they did back when they were young newlyweds, when they had young kids. And we see, you might say, a lot of loose ends being tied together as the movie unfolds. But most significantly, you'll note that as the film concludes, there's a lot of importance to the corn. Corn is a very dominant theme as the story progresses, from the beginning to the middle to the end. Jose Sanchez is always tending to his corn. So watch that scene real closely. Picture the symbolism of the corn, and you tell me what you think that means as the story wraps up. And I'm going to wrap up here because Mr. Nick here is really getting wild and crazy, much like Carlitos from the film. Maybe I should call him Carlitos instead of Nick. All right, but anyway, that's my review of the film or element, talking about some of the key points and key themes, symbolism, politics, all of that. I've got a study guide, some study questions that I want you to consider as you're watching the film. So as you're talking about the discussion, if you're going to talk about this, then from some of those questions, you don't have to answer all of them, but just pick and choose a handful, whatever you want to talk about, and comment on some of that. If you're going to talk about My Family, Mi Familia in this. For the discussion portion. As for A Day Without a Mexican, I'm pretty sure I've got an old film that I did either last semester or last fall, but I'll drag that out and attach that too. But I hope that for the purposes of this film, that this video helped to explain some of the things going on and give you a sense of what the film is all about, and and how it connects with the course of the class in terms of modern U.S. history. Okay, well that's it, everyone. So on behalf of El Profesor and his faithful and mischievous assistant, Mr. Nick, or Senor Nicolas, that's it from here. So you guys take care, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. Actually, I should say we'll talk to you guys again soon.